hopefully it'll be nice for our gathering time. So today we are in Mark chapter 8. Do you believe that Monday and Tuesday, yesterday and the day before, we covered an entire chapter, chapter 7. And today we have another fairly large portion of the story. We are in chapter 8, verses 1 through 21. The reason is it's all connected. And we'll probably, well, I don't want to say that for sure, but most definitely by the end of the week, we'll have made it through chapter 8 as well. So, gosh, 2 chapters in 1 week. That is moving quickly, which we know Mark does in the story. Now, this is an important section. If you pay attention to books and movies and TV shows, whether or not they're half-hour shows or hour-long shows, you know that the narrative arc, the story arc, typically reaches some important mile marker. Pardon me just a second. Yeah, so I'm totally clear until I go live, and now, yeah. So the narrative arc develops right into this midpoint section, this mile marker section about halfway through either the book or the movie or the episode. And that's a typical literary and cinematic arc. So we are reaching a mile marker in this narrative arc of Jesus teaching his disciples. Uh, the last several chapters we've seen is centered on Jesus leaving the focus of the crowd, and the crowd's still involved, but more and more Jesus is preparing his followers, his posse, his disciples, his failing forward ones, uh, for the mission that they will be left with. And they're still a long way off, which is really good news for us because I feel, in a lot of ways, like these guys very often. But this is an important time here. The end of chapter 7, we left it with he does all things well, if you remember. He even uh, has power over the deaf and the mute condition of human beings. And if you remember, he loosed the guy's ears and tongue in a healing. And it was another he even. Who is this? He even. Who is this? He even. Whether he's casting out demons or healing physical diseases or showing his mastery over nature, wind, waves, water, all that, he even. But the question always precedes, it's who is this that? From his followers, it's like, who is this? Who is this? Well, we're about to move from a question of who is this to a confession. From who is this to you are. And this is Jesus's goal on this journey with these guys, is that they, by being in proximity to his teaching, by being in proximity to his engagement with the crowd, and as they watch him perform miracles. When I say perform, I don't mean entertainment. I just mean express God's power through him. The goal is that they get it. And here in this section, as we approach this mile marker, they still really haven't gotten it. And it could be argued that they don't really get it until after Jesus' resurrection, as he shows up without opening doors in the room and begins to show evidence of the things that he promised before his crucifixion are now evident in his resurrection. But this is a critical mile marker we're approaching here. So let's start with verse 1 of chapter 8. Now, the setting is still in the Decapolis, which is a mostly Gentile, non-Jewish, southeast side of the Sea of Tiberias, also the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus is about to engage in what is obviously another miracle of the same type of the feeding of the 5,000. But it's a separate miracle. It's a separate proof of abundant provision based on his divine power. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, sound familiar? Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. And so again, Jesus is drawing these crowds who are interested in who he is. They're definitely interested in what he can do. His teaching is beyond anything they've ever heard, especially mostly Gentiles, to be approached by and taught by and provided for by someone who is a Jew is absolutely otherworldly. It's unheard of. But the thing is, Jesus has got two things going on here. He does always express compassion for meeting needs. If he sees a need, he wants to meet it. So we have hunger and we have fatigue. But he also has a desire to continue to bring his disciples along on this journey from question of who is this to confession, you are. And so verse 4 is funny to me. His disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? Now Mark puts it in the plural. His disciples answered. It's probable that they didn't all sing in a synchronized, simultaneous chorus. Ready, set, go. But where in this remote place can anyone get? It's probably one or maybe two that just reacted with, but wait a minute. I see this. Where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? And then instantly going back to the feeding of the 5,000 and trying then to grab the last word of the question and shoving it back in their mouth. And all the rest of the guys are going, really? You're going to go there again? So Jesus, patiently, verse 5, how many loaves do you have? 7, they replied. Now, if you remember the provision of the 5,000, it was 5 and then a couple of small fish. He told the crowd to sit out on the ground. Okay, organizing again like the feeding of the 5,000. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. They also had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, if you remember the picking up from the feeding of the 5,000, now remember that the feeding of the 5,000 happened in the area of Gennesaret, which was a mostly Jewish area on the southwest side, central to southwest side of the Sea of Galilee. But we're over here now on the other side of the lake in the Decapolis in a remote place. So these are two different demographics. I mean, there's a mixture of each, but largely Gentile in the Decapolis and largely Jewish in the Gennesaret side. But there's so many similarities here. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. I don't know if this is interesting to you. It was interesting to me as I studied this again. In the feeding of the 5,000, the baskets that were used were just sort of these carrying baskets for provisions. You see they're narrow on the top and they have a wide bottom so they stand up. This is a larger basket. It's actually a basket that can be used to carry larger cargo and has more volume. I'm still in verse 8. 7 basketfuls of broken pieces were left over. About 4,000 people were present. So this is 4,000 men and family members. After he had sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went into the region of Dalmanutha. So now we're going back across the Sea of Galilee into the mostly Jewish, well, there's some Gentile population of the region, still north of Jerusalem, southeast portion of the area around the Sea of Galilee. And now here we go with the religious leaders. Verse 11. The Pharisees came, the religious leaders, the arrogant, the ones who already have their mind made up. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. Now this word question, it literally means to trap him. It means to contend with him, to argue in a way that is hostile. They began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply. Now, I'm reading from the New International Version. The New International Version does not include an important part of this text in the original language. That's why it's important to compare several translations. The text in the Greek language says he sighed deeply in his spirit. So all that's combined here. Really, he sighed in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it." This same story of feeding of the 4,000 appears in Matthew 15 as well. And Jesus, in response to the Pharisees asking for or demanding a sign, says this: "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but I tell you, no sign other than the sign of Jonah will be given to it." So I'm going to let you study that on your own. Matthew expands this dialogue. You know, as we've talked about, Mark is pop, 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 detail, 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 quick and concise, and move on to the next. He gives you just enough detail and then moves on to the next thing. But there's an observation I want to make when it comes to Jesus dealing with people who already have their mind made up and who may feel threatened by him, which obviously the Pharisees do have their mind made up and they feel threatened by him. When Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it," my first thought is, do you mean other than the many signs already given? The casting out of the demon in the synagogue? The healing of the man with a withered hand in the synagogue in the presence of these religious leaders? The stories of renown far and wide of Jesus healing people from all stripes, from synagogue leaders' daughters, Jairus' daughter, to the least of these, the people who these proud Jews wouldn't have anything to do with? No sign will be given to it. You mean other than the many signs already that are proving out and building this identity of this unique one, this sui generis, this one of a kind? It reminds me of a poem I had seen a while back, and I had a problem digging it back up, but I did. And it's meaningful, I think. And it might be meaningful for those of us who are kind of always looking for a sign that God is either real, or that he's present, or that he's potent, or that he's powerful. And this has more to do with maybe the creation than it does with Jesus as the creator and the savior. But this is the poem. One man asked for a sign from God, and day by day the sun rose in pearl, in scarlet it set. Each night the stars appeared in bright array. Each morn the thirsty grass with dew was wet. And the corn failed not its harvest, nor the vine. And yet the one who asked, he saw no sign. You know, the biblical text, Romans chapter 1, says that the evidence of God is all around us. His invisible attributes and his divine nature, his qualities that can't be seen, invisible, are made visible in what he has made, so that we see, we understand, and we are without excuse when it comes to the question of God. Verse 13, after he said, "Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it," then he left them, which is so interesting because to leave these religious leaders, to turn your back on them and to walk away is kind of a similar scenario to turning your back on a king or an emperor and showing him your backside as you leave. So in a sense, this is like Jesus shaking the dust. Remember this symbol, this idea of shaking the dust off your sandals that he told his followers when he sent them out two by two. If someone receives you, stay with them and enjoy their hospitality. If any town doesn't receive you, then literally shake the dust off Shake the nuance off of their unbelief off your sandals as you leave that town as a sign to them that you know that they have rejected you. Then he left them, still in verse 13, got back into the boat and crossed to the other side. And this is where it gets embarrassing for them and maybe for me. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread. Uh-oh! Except for the one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They didn't have bread, and Jesus says, watch out for the yeast, a key ingredient to the rising of dough. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Like, what? They discussed this with one another and said, it's because we have no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? And then he uses three anatomical references in the physical body to refer to a greater spiritual understanding. Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Heart. Do you have eyes but fail to see? Eyes. And ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember, going back to their statement of, uh-oh, we have no bread. And don't you remember, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? And everybody answered, 12. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. And this is a cliffhanger. He said to them, do you still not understand? Now let's back all the way up and discuss what Jesus meant in his warning. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. So we have to remember and synthesize, put together everything we've learned so far of the Pharisees and their attitude toward Jesus, and Herod and his attitude toward Jesus as exhibited in Herod's execution of John the Baptist, and also Herod's reputation for protecting his own position and acting murderously in administering, quote unquote, his rulership in the region of Galilee. Remember, Jesus called him that fox. So summarizing and synthesizing all that we know together, probably the best way to describe the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod is this infusion. See, yeast has an invisible effect. Leaven, yeast, leaven, they're similar. They're not identical. They're both used in Jesus' teaching. But yeast has this invisible activating quality. It goes into a lump of dough, and then it activates. And this is always used in the negative sense in Jesus' teaching. As a matter of fact, all he's doing is bringing it forward from the culture of his day. Anytime it was said a little leaven leavens the whole lump, that wasn't a good thing. It means if you put in a little toxic catalyst, it is going to infuse itself in the whole body that it's been placed into. So the best way to understand, in synthesis, this yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod is the mixture of unbelief and a predisposition to not accept what you see plainly in front of you. Unbelief that brings you to a position of refusing what's plain right in front of your eyes. The yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. You see, the Pharisees refused to see who Jesus was because he threatened everything about their identity. their position as the religious rulers and authorities speaking for God in the nation. And Herod, as we'll see as the story develops, refused to see who Jesus is honestly, because his desire was to have his agenda imposed and his kingdom protected, his little k kingdom. As we've said before, Herod was not a king. Uh, so that just brings me to a close here. Anytime Jesus asks a question, do you still not understand? And talks about hard hearts, eyes that don't see, and ears that don't hear, he's talking about our spiritual sensitivity and perception. Jesus has plainly shown himself in this narrative that he is the one who can provide from a divine platform of power, that he meets needs abundantly to all who come to him in humility and really desperation, as we've seen through the story. But to those who have mixed in their view of Jesus with their own yeast of unbelief, there will be no softening of the heart. There will be no removing of the spiritual scales from the eyes, and there will be no unstopping of the ears to perceive spiritual truth. That reminds me of so much that's relevant throughout history and really in our contemporary day. Uh, as a pastor, I say this a lot, and there's really nothing new here that I'm talking about from day to day. It's simply refreshments and reinforcements. I've seen, and I'm looking now at the backs of chairs in our big room. I've seen people come in week after week and yet refuse to allow the reality of Jesus' identity and the reality of his care and the reality of his power to be appropriated into their lives. And it's so interesting to me. But what it reminds me of is that anytime my heart is softened, the scales are removed, and my ears are unstopped, it is a spiritual transaction. All I can do is remain submissive to what I know of Jesus at this point and beg him for more softness in my heart, for the thickness of the scales to be continued to be thinned, and for my ears to open more to the beauty of his spiritual song in my life. The leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod is also our leaven. If we are centered more around maintaining our little k kingdoms in this world and less about what it means to surrender to the King who will call all things into account and usher all who are submitted and soft and seeing and hearing into his capital K kingdom.